Amnesty International is taking their fight to the resource industries in our province that provide the major source of employment and opportunity in northeastern BC. On Thursday, they held a press conference in Vancouver for their new report. The report is entitled Out of Sight, Out of Mind, and looks into the gender, Indigenous rights, and energy development in northeastern British Columbia. Northeastern BC is our province's oil and gas country and currently the home of the Site C hydroelectric dam, under construction. The report claims that, quote, resource development has eroded the land base that provides the foundation for First Nations and Métis health and wellness in the region, while influxes of transient workers have driven up local prices and strained the social fabric. Increased rates of violent crime and diminished access to social services have placed Indigenous women and girls at increased risk of harm, while denying them the protections and support they need, unquote. I'm not going to deny that there are issues surrounding violence against Aboriginal women in rural BC, but for Amnesty International to target in particular the young men who mostly make up the resource workers that they talk about is misguided. RCMP statistics show, for instance, that 90% of First Nation women who are murdered are killed by somebody they know, with less than 10% being from strangers. And this is the same rate that it is for non-Aboriginal women who are murdered. Now I've got to tell you about the biggest surprise of the whole event today. Two of the most skeptical questions for Amnesty International on their report actually came from the media party, and the CBC no less. I couldn't believe it. A CBC reporter actually asked Amnesty International if their report had any statistics or evidence to back their claim that it was resource workers, and young men in particular, that are committing the violence against Indigenous women in these communities. Watch here as Amnesty is unable to answer CBC's skeptical question.
We're not suggesting that resource workers are in any way necessarily more likely, but the fact is when you have a community and you bring in an additional population that might be equivalent to 10% of the permanent population, might be equivalent to 50% of the permanent population, and those people who come in are disproportionately male, disproportionately young men, they are disproportionately from that same demographic where there's a greater incidence of violent crime, then inevitably the risk of crime increases. But you don't have a peer-reviewed scientific study on any of this? No, we don't.
For all the grief we've given the CBC, that was a great question. But did you catch Amnesty trying to explain that anywhere that brings in young men is bound to have more crime? You know, I wonder why they never mentioned these statistics when discussing the migrant crisis. Why isn't there concern for those communities? Later, I was able to bring up the fact that EI claims in both Fort St. John and Dawson Creek, BC are at the highest they've ever been, 3 times as high as they were in 2013. And how the fact there is a serious downturn in the local economy and the resource development, and how does that square with this report? And again, I was shocked to hear the CBC reporter cut them off during their response to demand an explanation of how it could be that Amnesty's claims that violence is being perpetrated by resource workers when there's been such a downturn in the resource industry.
People are still there, so it's a very cyclical economic cycle, and so there's people who are there waiting to see if things are going to get better, and so there are people who are out of work and they are there and they're waiting to see how things change, but there is still a whole lot of development that is going on in the region. There's fewer new wells going in, for example, but the total amount of wealth coming out of the ground cumulatively is actually greater than ever. So it's things change pretty fast up there, but there's still a lot of development that is going on despite the downturn in the economy right now.
So which is it? Is it transient resource workers who come into these camps that are committing violence and abuse towards women? Or is it the people now out of work in a region seeing tough economic times and the uptick in violence and crime that always follows these tough economic times? And as for the claim that there is more wealth being extracted from the ground than ever before in northeastern BC, well, that's completely false. If we look at the province's natural gas royalties in this year's budget, they are way down to only $128 million. Compare that to $453 million collected in the 2014-2015 fiscal year. There are 2 reasons for the fall. 1, natural gas prices are depressed right now, and 2, BC has lost major market share in the US thanks to the shale gas revolution and fracking. that has allowed the US to shore up their own domestic supply, reducing the need for BC exports. Amnesty International has their facts all wrong, and they're attempting to demonize young men who look for work in the resource industries in northeastern BC. Their attacks on those young men are baseless and not supported by evidence or statistics, despite all the powerful stories and hardship outlined in their report. For the Rebel.media, I'm Christopher Wilson. Thanks so much for watching. If you're a member of the resource community and you're sick and tired of the baseless attacks on your employees, your workers, and your colleagues in the field, then make sure you keep it locked to the Rebel.media and subscribe to our YouTube channel.